November 12th, 1982, began like any other autumn day in Boston. The city was embracing the seasonal chill, trees in Commonwealth Park shedding their last colorful leaves. Early morning joggers followed their usual routes, breathing clouds of condensation into the crisp air. At 6:47 a.m., Martin Kelly, a 52-year-old postal worker on his daily run, veered off the main path to tie his shoelace. That's when he spotted something unusual partially concealed behind a cluster of bushes near the pond. What Kelly discovered would haunt Boston for decades to come. The body of 23-year-old Elaine Mercer lay carefully positioned, as if the perpetrator had taken time to arrange her. Elaine was a second-year law student at Boston University, known for her brilliant mind and dedication to civil rights. She had last been seen leaving the university library around 9:30 p.m. the previous evening, telling classmates she planned to take a shortcut through Commonwealth Park to her apartment on Marlborough Street. Boston Police Department responded within minutes of Kelly's frantic call. Detective Raymond Sullivan, just 3 months into his promotion to homicide, was assigned as lead investigator. At 34, Sullivan was regarded as one of the department's rising stars, methodical and relentless. As he surveyed the crime scene, he made a promise to himself that would follow him for the next 4 decades. He would find whoever did this. The Mercer case wasn't just another homicide, Sullivan would later recall in his unpublished memoir. There was something different about it, something that told me this wasn't a random act of violence. The perpetrator had left almost nothing behind. No weapon, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just a brilliant young woman whose life had been cut short in the most deliberate way. The initial investigation proceeded by the book. Crime scene technicians collected what little physical evidence existed: fibers from Elaine's clothing, soil samples, and partial fingerprints that ultimately matched only the victim's. The medical examiner determined she had died between 10 p.m. and midnight on November 11th. The cause of death was asphyxiation, with minimal signs of struggle, suggesting Elaine either knew her attacker or had been taken completely by surprise. Sullivan and his partner, Detective Maria Gonzalez, spent the next 72 hours interviewing everyone in Elaine's life. Her roommate, Sylvia Chen, confirmed Elaine's library study session and expected route home. Professors described her as exceptional, but not one to make enemies. Fellow students spoke of her focus and determination, how she often stayed late at the library, always taking the same path home, despite concerns about its safety after dark. "We kept coming back to the route," Sullivan noted in his case files. Commonwealth Park wasn't considered particularly dangerous in 1982, but it wasn't well lit either. Elaine had been warned about crossing it at night, but she'd been doing it for over a year without incident. Was she being watched? Had someone learned her routine? By the end of the first week, investigators had interviewed over 60 people, including university staff, neighborhood residents, and known offenders in the area. They'd received dozens of tips through the department's hotline, each meticulously followed up and ultimately dismissed. The case was beginning to show the telltale signs of what detectives dread most: a trail going cold. The Mercer family arrived from Minneapolis the day after Elaine's body was discovered. Thomas and Margaret Mercer, both educators, and Elaine's younger brother Daniel, then a college freshman, moved into a hotel near the police station. Every morning for 3 weeks, they would appear at Sullivan's desk asking for updates, bringing coffee and occasionally home-cooked food when Margaret couldn't bear the inactivity. "The worst part of my job," Sullivan later wrote, "was facing the Mercers each morning with nothing new to tell them. I watched hope slowly drain from their eyes, replaced by a kind of resigned determination. They wouldn't leave Boston without answers. But increasingly, I wasn't sure I could provide any." 1 month into the investigation, a potential lead emerged. A groundskeeper at Boston University, Nathan Vance, was identified as having been in Commonwealth Park the evening of the murder. At 38, Vance had worked at the university for nearly 3 years, maintaining the athletic fields and occasionally assisting with campus security. Initial interviews revealed nothing suspicious. Vance claimed he'd been crossing the park after finishing his shift, heading to a bus stop on the opposite side. With no evidence to contradict his statement and a superficially solid alibi from a co-worker who claimed they'd clocked out together, Vance remained merely one of dozens of persons of interest. The case file grew thicker as December arrived, bringing with it the first snow of the season and a noticeable cooling of public interest. Media coverage, initially prominent, dwindled to occasional updates buried in the middle pages of the Boston Globe. The department assigned new cases to Sullivan and Gonzalez, though they continued to pursue leads on the Mercer homicide whenever possible. By the 6-month mark, the investigation had effectively stalled. The physical evidence collected had yielded nothing conclusive. DNA testing, still in its infancy in the early 1980s, was prohibitively expensive and considered unreliable by many courts. What little biological material had been preserved from the crime scene, skin cells under Elaine's fingernails, suggesting she may have scratched her attacker, was insufficient for the technology of the time. The Mercer family returned to Minneapolis in January 1983, having extended their stay in Boston far beyond what they could reasonably afford. Thomas Mercer's final conversation with Sullivan took place in the detective's car outside the airport terminal. "He didn't blame me," Sullivan recounted years later. "That almost made it worse. He just put his hand on my shoulder and said, 'We know you did everything you could, detective. We'll be waiting when you find something.'" The certainty in his voice, not if, but when, has stayed with me all these years. Back in Minneapolis, the Mercers established a scholarship in Elaine's name at her undergraduate alma mater. They gave interviews to local and national media, hoping to keep the case alive in the public consciousness. They hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing the police investigation before reluctantly confirming what Sullivan already knew. Without new evidence or a confession, the case might never be solved. Sullivan continued to revisit the case file periodically over the next several years, but with diminishing returns. Each review yielded the same frustrating dead ends. By 1987, he had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to supervise a different unit. The Mercer homicide file was officially designated cold, not closed, but no longer actively investigated. "It became the ghost that followed me," Sullivan wrote. "Every successful case afterward felt somehow incomplete because Elaine's killer was still out there. I kept her photograph in my desk drawer. Sometimes between cases I'd take it out and look at it, silently apologizing for failing her." The years passed. Sullivan married, had 2 children, divorced. He rose through the ranks to lieutenant, then captain. The Mercer case file moved from his active drawer to a box in his home office, then eventually to the department's expanding cold case storage facility. New crimes demanded attention. New victims needed justice. But neither Sullivan nor the Mercer family ever truly moved on. What none of them could have anticipated was that the seeds of resolution had already been planted, not in the investigative work of 1982, but in the preservation of evidence that would one day speak with a clarity impossible at the time of collection. The partial fingerprints, the skin cells, the fibers carefully catalogued and stored. These silent witnesses would wait patiently for nearly 4 decades until science and circumstance finally aligned to give them voice. In Boston's evidence storage facility, box M11928 sat undisturbed on a metal shelf, gathering dust but preserving its secrets. Inside, sealed in plastic and carefully labeled, lay the key to unlocking a mystery that had haunted a family, a detective, and a city for nearly 40 years. The evidence wasn't gone. It was merely waiting for the right questions to be asked. Meanwhile, in a quiet neighborhood in Tempe, Arizona, a man who now called himself Nathan Vance lived a careful, quiet life. He had left Boston in late 1983, working a series of maintenance and security jobs across 5 states before settling in the Southwest. He lived alone, kept to himself, and never spoke of his time in Boston. To his neighbors, he was simply a private, somewhat reclusive retiree, one of countless such men living out their later years in the sun-drenched retirement communities of Arizona. But occasionally, when the national news would feature stories about cold cases solved through advanced DNA technology, Nathan Vance would abruptly turn off his television. On those nights, neighbors might notice his lights burning until dawn. As if sleep had become suddenly impossible, the clock was ticking toward justice. It would take a fresh pair of eyes, emerging technologies, and one detective's unrelenting commitment to finally bring the truth to light. January 15th, 2021. The Boston Police Department's cold case storage facility resembled a library of forgotten tragedies. Row upon row of metal shelving housed cardboard boxes, each containing the remnants of someone's worst day, evidence collected, documented, and ultimately filed away when investigations reached their limits. Tara Blackwood hadn't set out to become a cold case analyst. With a PhD in forensic science and a specialization in DNA analysis, she had spent the first decade of her career in the sterile environment of crime labs, processing current evidence and testifying in ongoing cases. But the department initiative to digitize and review unsolved homicides had drawn her into this underground repository of unfinished stories. The digitization project was originally just about preservation, Blackwood would later explain in her presentation at the National Cold Case Symposium. Many of these files were deteriorating. Photographs were fading, paper was yellowing, and with them, the chances of resolution were literally disintegrating before our eyes. The project had begun 6 months earlier, with Blackwood and 2 junior analysts methodically working through the cases chronologically. That January morning, she pulled box M11-1928 from the shelf, the Elaine Mercer homicide from 1982. Nothing distinguished it from the dozens of other cases she'd processed that month, except perhaps its meticulous organization, a testament to the original investigating officer's thoroughness. Blackwood started with the case file, carefully scanning each document into the department's new digital system. The initial police report, witness statements, forensic analyses, interview transcripts, all preserved now as digital files, searchable and accessible to current investigators. It was while reviewing the original autopsy report that something caught her attention. The medical examiner noted trace evidence beneath the victim's fingernails, Blackwood observed in her case notes. Standard procedure at the time was to collect and preserve such evidence, but there's no follow-up analysis in the file. Given the technology of the early 1980s, this isn't surprising, but it raises an interesting question. Was this evidence ever re-examined as DNA testing became more sophisticated? Further investigation revealed that while the case had been periodically reviewed over the decades, no one had submitted the preserved biological samples for modern DNA analysis. The evidence inventory listed sample E7 fingernail scrapings as still preserved in the evidence locker, sealed in its original container. Blackwood's interest was piqued. The department's protocol for the digitization project didn't technically include re-examining physical evidence. Her mandate was simply to preserve the existing documentation. But something about the Mercer case resonated with her. Perhaps it was the detailed notes from Detective Sullivan, whose frustration and determination were evident in every carefully typed page. Or perhaps it was the photograph of Elaine Mercer herself, a young woman whose ambitions had been cut short just as Blackwood's own legal career was beginning. I'm requesting permission to submit sample E7 from the Mercer homicide for modern DNA analysis, Blackwood wrote in an email to her supervisor, Captain Lauren Reeves. The sample has never been tested using current methods, and preliminary review suggests it may contain sufficient material for a full profile or at least a partial match. Reeves' response came within the hour. Request approved. Keep me updated. The sample was carefully retrieved from evidence storage, documented, and sent to the department's state-of-the-art forensic laboratory. The contrast between the yellowed evidence tag with its typewritten description and the gleaming equipment of the modern lab couldn't have been more stark. In 1982, DNA fingerprinting was still years away from common use in criminal investigations. Now, Blackwood could potentially extract a full genetic profile from just a few cells. While waiting for the laboratory results, Blackwood continued her review of the case file. She created a timeline of the investigation, noting the initial flurry of activity, followed by the gradual tapering off of new leads. One name appeared repeatedly in Sullivan's notes: Nathan Vance, the university groundskeeper who had been in Commonwealth Park the night of the murder. Vance's alibi was never fully corroborated, Blackwood noted. His co-worker confirmed they clocked out together, but couldn't verify Vance's whereabouts after that point. Sullivan interviewed Vance 3 times, each interview more detailed than the last, but ultimately lacked probable cause for a search warrant or arrest. Further into the file, Blackwood discovered a supplementary report from March 1983, 4 months after the murder. Vance had abruptly resigned from his position at Boston University, citing family reasons, and left Massachusetts. Sullivan had made inquiries, but found no evidence of criminal activity or connection to the Mercer case to justify tracking Vance across state lines. 2 weeks after submitting the fingernail scrapings for analysis, Blackwood received the preliminary results. The sample contained degraded but potentially usable DNA from 2 sources, Elaine Mercer herself and an unknown individual. The foreign DNA was fragmentary, but the lab had managed to isolate several distinct genetic markers. "This is significant," Dr. Marcus Chen, the lab director, explained when Blackwood came to review the findings. In 1982, this evidence would have told us virtually nothing. Today, even this partial profile gives us something to work with. It's not enough for a definitive identification, but it could certainly exclude suspects or support other evidence. Blackwood immediately reported these findings to Captain Reeves, who authorized the next step, running the partial DNA profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system which contained genetic information from convicted offenders across the country. The initial CODIS search returned no matches, a disappointing but not unexpected result. The system was comprehensive but not exhaustive. It contained only DNA from individuals who had been convicted of certain crimes after DNA collection became standard procedure. If Elaine Mercer's killer had never been convicted of another offense, or had been convicted before DNA collection was implemented, they wouldn't be in the database. Undeterred, Blackwood explored another avenue. The digitization project had given her access to dozens of other cold cases from the same era, and she began cross-referencing the Mercer homicide with similar unsolved crimes. Her systematic approach yielded unexpected connections. "I've identified 2 other cases with significant similarities to the Mercer homicide," Blackwood reported to Reeves in February 2021. A 1981 murder in Portland, Maine, and a 1983 case in Providence, Rhode Island. Both victims were young women in their 20s. Both were graduate students. Both were asphyxiated with minimal signs of struggle, and both were found in public parks. This potential pattern had never been identified before, likely because the cases spanned 3 different jurisdictions in an era before easy digital communication between departments. Blackwood requested the physical evidence from both cases be located and examined for potential DNA evidence comparable to what they'd found under Elaine Mercer's fingernails. While waiting for cooperation from the other departments, Blackwood decided to track down the original investigator. Raymond Sullivan had retired from the Boston Police Department in 2011 after a distinguished 35-year career. His personnel file listed his last known address as Rockport, a small coastal town north of Boston. Blackwood's call to Sullivan was initially met with wariness. After decades in law enforcement, the retired detective had developed a healthy skepticism toward unexpected inquiries. But when Blackwood mentioned Elaine Mercer, Sullivan's tone changed immediately. "You're looking at the Mercer case." The surprise in his voice was evident even through the phone. "After all this time, we found potentially usable DNA under her fingernails," Blackwood explained. "I'm hoping you might have insights that didn't make it into the official reports." There was a long pause before Sullivan responded. "I kept my own notes," he finally said. "Things that were hunches rather than evidence. Observations that didn't seem relevant at the time. I'd be happy to share them with you." The following weekend, Blackwood drove to Rockport. Sullivan's home was a modest Cape Cod-style house overlooking the harbor, its weathered shingles and blue trim fitting perfectly into the seaside landscape. The man who greeted her at the door bore little resemblance to the young detective in the personnel photographs she'd seen. At 73, Raymond Sullivan's hair had turned white, and decades of police work had etched deep lines in his face. But his eyes remained sharp, observant, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing details others missed. Sullivan led her to a small study overlooking the water. One entire wall was lined with bookshelves, but instead of books, they held carefully labeled file boxes. He pulled one down without hesitation. Clearly, he knew exactly where the Mercer case materials were stored. "I never officially checked these out," he admitted, opening the box on his desk. "Technically, I shouldn't have had personal copies of case files, but Elaine Mercer's case, it never left me. When I retired, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving these behind." The box contained duplicates of the official reports, but also handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and a leather-bound journal. Sullivan handed the journal to Blackwood. "This is what didn't make it into the official record," he explained. "Impressions, theories, connections I couldn't substantiate. Some of it will sound like the ramblings of an obsessed detective, which I suppose I was." Blackwood spent hours going through Sullivan's personal notes. Most were consistent with the official record, but provided additional context and detail. His suspicions about Nathan Vance, however, were far more extensive than the official file suggested. "Vance's alibi never sat right with me," Sullivan had written in March 1983. His co-worker, Jenkins, confirmed they clocked out together at 8:15 p.m., but when pressed, admitted he didn't actually see Vance leave campus. Vance claimed he cut through Commonwealth Park to catch the 8:45 bus home, putting him in the exact location where Elaine would have been walking around 9:45 p.m. But the bus driver doesn't remember him, and none of the other regular passengers I interviewed recalled seeing him that night. Further entries detailed Sullivan's growing frustration as his supervisors pressured him to pursue other leads. Without physical evidence linking Vance to the crime, and with dozens of other potential suspects to investigate, Sullivan had been forced to move on. His final entry about Vance, dated April 1983, simply stated, "Vance resigned today, moving to New Hampshire according to HR. Request to continue investigation denied. Case going cold." As the afternoon light began to fade, Sullivan made tea, and they sat looking out at the harbor. "Do you think there's really a chance after all this time?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, as if afraid to hope. "Science has come a long way since 1982, Blackwood replied, "and I've found potential connections to similar cases that might strengthen the investigation. I can't make promises, but yes, I think there's a chance." Sullivan nodded slowly. "The Mercers deserved better than what we gave them," he said quietly. "Thomas and Margaret were so patient, so understanding, even as I failed them repeatedly. They never once blamed me, though God knows they had reason to." "Are they still alive?" Blackwood asked. "Thomas passed in 2015. Margaret is in assisted living in Minneapolis. Their son Daniel keeps in touch with me, Christmas cards mostly. He's a professor now, has children of his own." Sullivan's voice grew firmer. "If you find something, I want to be the one to tell Margaret. I owe her that much." Before Blackwood left, Sullivan gave her one last piece of information, a detail he'd never been able to verify, but that had haunted him for decades. About 6 months before Elaine's murder, there was an incident at the university library. he said. A female graduate student reported being followed by a maintenance worker. She complained to security, but by the time they responded, the man was gone. She couldn't provide a detailed description, just that he was average height, brown hair, wearing maintenance coveralls. The incident report was filed away, and I only discovered it by chance months after Elaine's murder. You think it was Vance? Blackwood said. It wasn't a question, Sullivan nodded. I could never prove it. The student had transferred to another university by then, but it suggested a pattern of behavior that troubled me deeply. Back in Boston, Blackwood's investigation gained momentum. The Portland Police Department located their case files from the 1981 homicide and confirmed they still had preserved biological evidence, including fingernail scrapings similar to those in the Mercer case. Providence was less helpful. Their evidence had been compromised in a storage facility flood in 1997, leaving only documentation. In March 2021, the DNA results from the Portland case arrived. The partial profile showed significant similarities to the unknown DNA from Elaine Mercer's fingernails. Not a definitive match given the degraded samples, but enough correlation to suggest the same perpetrator might be responsible for both crimes. This potential connection transformed the investigation. What had begun as a routine digitization of a cold case was now an active, multi-state investigation into a possible serial offender. Captain Reeves assigned additional resources, including a detective specializing in cold cases and a research analyst to help track Vance's movements over the decades. What they discovered was troubling. After leaving Boston in 1983, Nathan Vance had moved to Rochester, New Hampshire, where he worked as a security guard at a community college for 18 months. He then relocated to Burlington, Vermont, taking a similar position at the university there. In 1986, he moved again, this time to Syracuse, New York. Each move followed a similar pattern: maintenance or security work at or near an educational institution, followed by an abrupt departure after approximately 2 years. More disturbing was what the analyst found when cross-referencing Vance's locations with unsolved homicides in those areas. In each city where Vance had lived between 1983 and 1990, there was at least one unsolved murder of a young woman with circumstances similar to the Mercer case. None had been connected before, each investigated as an isolated incident by separate jurisdictions. We're looking at potentially 6 related homicides across 4 states, Blackwood reported to Reeves in April 2021. The pattern is consistent: young women, often students, asphyxiated, minimal struggle, bodies found in parks or other public spaces. And in each location, Nathan Vance was working in a position that would have given him access and opportunity. The investigation now faced a critical challenge: locating Vance. His trail went cold after 1990, when he left his position at a community college in Syracuse. No employment records, tax filings, or address changes appeared under his name after that point. He either died, left the country, or changed his identity, the research analyst concluded. Given the pattern we're seeing, I'd bet on the latter. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sullivan, reinvigorated by the new investigation, had reached out to former colleagues across the Northeast, asking if anyone remembered Vance or had information about where he might have gone. A retired detective from Syracuse recalled interviewing Vance as part of a routine canvass after a 1990 homicide. What stuck in his memory was Vance mentioning plans to move to Arizona for his health. Said the cold was bad for his joints, the retired detective remembered. Mentioned Tempe specifically. I only remember because my brother-in-law had moved there the year before, and we talked about how the summer heat was even worse than the winter cold. With this lead, the investigation focused on Tempe, Arizona, but Nathan Vance did not appear in any Arizona records under that name. Blackwood's team began searching property records, employment databases, and public documents for men of Vance's approximate age who had arrived in Tempe around 1990. The list of possibilities was dauntingly long. The key breakthrough came in May 2021, when Blackwood received permission to use a relatively new and controversial investigative technique, forensic genetic genealogy. Using the partial DNA profiles from the Boston and Portland cases, specialists created a genetic fingerprint that could be compared against public genealogy databases where people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles to research their family histories. The technique didn't identify Vance directly. His DNA wasn't in these databases, but it identified several distant cousins. Working backward through family trees and cross-referencing with their Tempe suspects, the team identified a man named Neil Vincent, who had appeared in Arizona records in early 1991. Vincent's age, physical description, and employment history at various maintenance positions matched what they knew about Vance. Background checks revealed that Vincent had retired in 2013 and currently lived in a small house on the outskirts of Tempe. He had no criminal record in Arizona, had never married, and kept largely to himself, according to neighbors. His driver's license photo, obtained through law enforcement channels, showed an older man with gray hair and glasses, but facial recognition software indicated a strong probability that Neil Vincent and Nathan Vance were the same person. "We have enough for surveillance," Reeves concluded after reviewing the evidence, "but not enough for an arrest warrant or even a DNA sample request. We need to place him under observation and look for an opportunity to legally obtain his DNA for comparison." As May turned to June, a small team of investigators established surveillance on Vincent's Tempe residence. They watched as he followed a predictable routine: grocery shopping on Tuesday mornings, breakfast at the same diner every Sunday, occasional visits to a nearby library. He was now 77 years old, moved slowly with the aid of a cane, and appeared to have no close friends or family. The team obtained his DNA from a coffee cup he left at the diner, carefully collected by an investigator posing as a busboy. The sample was rushed to the lab, where it was compared against the partial profiles from the Boston and Portland cold cases. On June 17, 2021, almost 40 years after Elaine Mercer's murder, the lab confirmed what Sullivan had suspected all along. Neil Vincent, formerly Nathan Vance, was a match to the DNA found under Elaine Mercer's fingernails and to the evidence from the Portland case. The evidence was now sufficient for an arrest warrant. But before taking action, Blackwood made one more discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of Vincent's crimes. In his trash, investigators recovered several medication bottles prescribed for conditions including arthritis and heart disease. Among them was a small, unlabeled container of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, carefully trimmed and preserved. Each clipping reported on the initial investigations of the murders the team had connected to Vance's movements. More disturbing were handwritten notes on the margins, details that had never been released to the public, information only the killer would know. Armed with this additional evidence, the Joint Task Force was ready to make their move. After nearly 4 decades, justice for Elaine Mercer was finally within reach. But the most shocking revelations were yet to come, hidden in the quiet home of a man who had spent half a lifetime believing he had escaped the consequences of his actions. As the Arizona sun set on June 18, 2021, the task force prepared to arrest Neil Vincent, unaware that inside his modest home lay a journal that would answer questions that had haunted investigators across 5 states for decades. A modern Bluebeard's chamber of secrets that would finally bring closure to families who had waited far too long for answers. The arrest of Neil Vincent unfolded with little drama on the morning of June 19, 2021. As he emerged from his Tempe home for his regular Saturday trip to the local hardware store, he found himself surrounded by federal agents and local police. The elderly man offered no resistance, his expression shifting from confusion to resignation as the officers announced the charges. The 1982 murder of Elaine Mercer in Boston, Massachusetts. He seemed almost relieved, noted FBI Special Agent Marcus Reed, who led the arrest team. When I read the charges, he closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for 40 years. While Vincent was being processed at the Maricopa County Detention Center, a forensic team executed a search warrant on his modest ranch-style home. What they discovered inside transformed the case from the resolution of a single cold case into something far more extensive. The house itself was unremarkable, sparsely furnished, meticulously clean, with few personal touches. The kitchen contained a single place setting, the living room a worn recliner positioned precisely in front of a small television. But in the second bedroom, which Vincent had converted into an office, investigators discovered a false wall behind a bookshelf. Within the hidden space was a metal filing cabinet containing what would become known as the Chronicles, 12 bound journals documenting 4 decades of Vincent's thoughts, movements, and crimes. The journals were organized chronologically, Blackwood would later testify. Each was labeled with a range of years: 1980, 1982, 1983, 1985, and so on. They were handwritten in meticulous cursive, with newspaper clippings, photographs, and what appeared to be souvenirs interspersed throughout. The contents of these journals shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Vincent had documented not just the 6 murders they had connected to him, but 5 additional killings spanning from 1980 to 1994. Each entry included details never released to the public, confirming his responsibility beyond any doubt. More disturbingly, he had developed an elaborate system for selecting and stalking his victims, all young women in academic settings. The pattern was far more deliberate than we initially understood, Blackwood explained in her briefing to the multi-state task force that assembled in the wake of Vincent's arrest. He deliberately sought employment at or near universities, specifically positions that would render him virtually invisible: maintenance, security, groundskeeping. He would observe potential victims for weeks, learning their routines, identifying vulnerabilities. He called this process research, as if his victims were subjects in some twisted study. The journals revealed that Elaine Mercer had been tracked for nearly 3 months before her murder. Vincent had noted her regular path through Commonwealth Park, the times she typically left the library, even details about her study habits and social circle. Similar documentation existed for each of his other victims, revealing a level of premeditation that chilled investigators to the core. Back in Boston, Raymond Sullivan received the news of Vincent's arrest with a complex mix of emotions. The vindication of his long-held suspicions was overshadowed by the revelation that Vincent had continued killing long after leaving Boston. "I should have pushed harder," he told Blackwood during a phone call following the arrest. "If I'd convinced my superiors to pursue him more aggressively, maybe those other women would still be alive." "You did everything possible with the evidence available at the time," Blackwood assured him. "DNA technology simply didn't exist then. Even if you'd arrested him, a conviction would have been nearly impossible without it." Sullivan's response was subdued. "Tell that to the families of the women he killed after Elaine." The investigation now expanded dramatically, with police departments from 5 states collaborating to build cases for each of the murders documented in Vincent's journals. Forensic teams re-examined preserved evidence from the previously unsolved cases, finding DNA matches in 7 of the 11 total murders. In the remaining 4, other physical evidence and Vincent's detailed documentation provided compelling links. As investigators delved deeper into Vincent's background, a clearer picture emerged of how he had evaded capture for so long. Born Nathan Edward Vance in 1944 in rural Pennsylvania, he had led an unremarkable early life. Average student, brief military service with an honorable discharge, a series of maintenance and security jobs. No significant criminal record, just 2 minor arrests in his 20s, one for trespassing and another for voyeurism, both resulting in fines rather than jail time. What's most striking is how ordinary he appears on paper. noted Dr. Eleanor Matheson, the forensic psychologist assigned to the case. No red flags that would have singled him out as a potential serial killer. He maintained employment, paid his taxes, kept to himself. He wasn't charming or sociable like many predators. Instead, he cultivated invisibility. People literally didn't see him, even when he was right in front of them. This talent for invisibility had served Vincent well during his active killing years. After each murder, he would wait approximately 6 to 8 months, then relocate to a new city, always securing similar employment before he moved. In 1991, after the Syracuse murder, he legally changed his name to Neil Vincent and relocated to Arizona, where he continued his pattern for 3 more years before apparently stopping in 1994. The journals offer no clear explanation for why he stopped killing, Dr. Matheson observed. The final murder entry from October 1994 is followed by a gap of several months. Then entries become more philosophical, less focused on specific women. He references the weight of memory and living with ghosts. My preliminary assessment is that he didn't stop because he wanted to, but because maintaining his double life became too demanding as he aged. Meanwhile, Tara Blackwood had taken on a particularly sensitive aspect of the investigation, contacting the families of Vincent's victims. For the cases that had remained unsolved, this meant reopening profound wounds while simultaneously offering the closure many had stopped hoping for. The Mercer family was her first priority. As Sullivan had requested, he accompanied Blackwood to Minneapolis to deliver the news to Margaret Mercer in person. At 88, Margaret resided in an assisted living facility, her health fragile, but her mind still sharp. Her son Daniel, now a 60-year-old history professor, joined them for the meeting. Sullivan's reunion with the Mercers was emotional. Though they had exchanged Christmas cards over the decades, they hadn't seen each other in person since the early days of the investigation. Margaret embraced the retired detective, her frail frame belying the strength of her grip. "You never forgot her," she said simply. "Thank you for that." When Blackwood explained the developments, the DNA match, Vincent's arrest, the discovery of his journals, Margaret listened in silence, occasionally nodding. Daniel asked pointed questions about the evidence, the prosecution's strategy, the likelihood of conviction. Only when Blackwood mentioned the other victims did Margaret speak again. "Those poor families," she murmured. "All this time, not knowing, at least we had a face, a name to blame. They had nothing." In the days that followed, Blackwood met with other families across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and New York. Some reacted with tears, others with quiet gratitude, still others with anger that justice had taken so long. Each meeting reinforced her commitment to the case, transforming statistical victims into real people, with grieving families who had carried their loss for decades. By August 2021, the task force had assembled comprehensive cases for all 11 murders. Given the complexity of trying crimes across multiple jurisdictions, federal prosecutors had taken the lead, charging Vincent under statutes that allowed for consolidated proceedings. The decision was made to begin with the Mercer case, as it had the strongest DNA evidence and would establish a foundation for the remaining prosecutions. Vincent's court-appointed attorney, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against his client, approached prosecutors about a potential plea agreement. Vincent, now confronting his mortality at 77 and suffering from advancing heart disease, expressed willingness to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. After consultations with the victims' families, prosecutors accepted the deal. On September 7, 2021, nearly 40 years after Elaine Mercer's body was discovered in Commonwealth Park, Neil Vincent appeared in federal court in Boston. The courtroom was filled with family members of his victims, law enforcement officers who had worked the cases over the decades, and media representatives from across the country. Raymond Sullivan sat in the front row beside Margaret and Daniel Mercer, his face solemn as he watched the man he had suspected all those years ago shuffle into court, shackled and wearing a prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. Vincent spoke only to confirm his identity and enter his guilty plea. The judge, acknowledging the exceptional nature of the case, allowed representatives from each victim's family to deliver impact statements before sentencing. For 3 hours, the courtroom listened as parents, siblings, children and spouses described lives cut short and the decades of grief that followed. Margaret Mercer, assisted to the podium by her son, spoke last. Her voice, though wavering with age, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. 40 years ago, a brilliant young woman walked through a park on her way home from studying law, the law that should have protected her. Elaine believed in justice. She believed in the inherent goodness of people. Her killer took her life, but he did not take that belief from our family. Today, delayed but not denied, justice has finally arrived. Vincent was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, he paused briefly, turning toward the gallery where Sullivan sat with the Mercers. For a moment, their eyes met. The detective who had never forgotten, and the killer who had almost escaped justice. No words were exchanged, but Sullivan would later describe it as the moment he finally set down a burden he had carried for 4 decades. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the task force's work continued. Vincent's journals contained references to other unsolved crimes. Not additional murders, but assaults and stalking incidents dating back to the 1970s. Cold case units across the country began re-examining cases with similar patterns, considering Vincent as a potential suspect. For Tara Blackwood, the Vincent case represented both an ending and a beginning. The successful resolution had demonstrated the power of modern forensic techniques applied to cold cases, particularly the potential of genetic genealogy to identify suspects who had never been in the criminal DNA database. With this proof of concept, she secured funding to expand Boston's cold case unit, focusing specifically on unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence. Each box in our evidence storage represents someone's loved one, someone's unresolved grief, Blackwood noted in her proposal for the expanded unit. With advances in technology, we now have the tools to speak for victims who have waited decades for justice. We owe it to them and to their families to re-examine these cases with every resource at our disposal. The media dubbed the initiative the Mercer Project. Much to Blackwood's discomfort, she felt it placed too much emphasis on a single case when so many others deserved equal attention. But Margaret Mercer herself endorsed the name during a press conference announcing the project's launch. "My daughter believed that every person deserved justice, regardless of who they were or how long ago they suffered," Margaret stated, her eyes clear and focused despite her age. If her name helps bring that justice to others, then she continues her work even now. Raymond Sullivan, though officially retired, became an unofficial consultant to the project, reviewing cold cases and offering insights from his decades of experience. For the first time since leaving the force, he found himself regularly driving into Boston, his purpose renewed by the prospect of resolving more long-dormant cases. Neil Vincent, meanwhile, was transferred to a federal medical facility in Missouri to serve his sentences. His health deteriorated rapidly in confinement, but before his condition became critical, he agreed to a series of interviews with FBI behavioral analysts seeking to understand his methodology and motivations. These interviews, conducted over 6 months, yielded valuable insights that would later inform approaches to similar cases. In one of his final interviews, Vincent offered a perspective that particularly disturbed his interviewers. "You think catching me brings closure," he said, his voice weakened by illness, but his eyes still sharp. "But for everyone like me, you find there are others who live and die without ever being suspected. The perfect predator isn't the one who leaves no evidence. It's the one no one notices in the first place. The chilling assessment served as both a warning and a challenge to investigators like Blackwood, who had dedicated their careers to pursuing justice for the forgotten. It underscored the importance of their work, not just in resolving past crimes, but in developing the tools and techniques to prevent future predators from exploiting the same vulnerabilities Vincent had. By early 2022, the Mercer Project had identified 16 additional cold cases with potential for resolution using advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. 3 had already yielded promising leads, with arrests pending in 2. For each case, Blackwood followed the same meticulous process she'd applied to the Mercer homicide, digitizing old files, re-examining evidence with modern techniques, and searching for connections that previous investigators might have missed. On April 15, 2022, almost exactly 1 year after the breakthrough in the Mercer case, Blackwood received word that Neil Vincent had died in custody of heart failure. The news prompted mixed reactions among the victims' families. Some expressed frustration that he had escaped serving his full sentence, while others found a certain peace in knowing he was gone. For Sullivan, Vincent's death brought an unexpected sense of emptiness. "I spent so many years thinking about him, trying to find him," he confided to Blackwood over coffee in his Rockport home. "Now he's gone, and I'm still here, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with that." "You do what you've always done," Blackwood replied. "You keep looking for the truth. There are other cases, other families waiting for answers." Sullivan nodded slowly, gazing out at the harbor where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch. "You know," he said after a moment, "when I first started in homicide, an old detective told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Every murder leaves a hole in the world.' Our job isn't just to catch killers, it's to help fill those holes, even just a little, with truth." Though, as the sun began to set over Rockport Harbor, casting long shadows across the water, Sullivan and Blackwood continued discussing the next case on their list. Another box pulled from storage, another life cut short, another family waiting for the truth that might finally allow them to move forward. The work of justice, they understood, was never truly complete, but in the resolution of the Mercer case, they had demonstrated that persistence, scientific advancement, and unwavering commitment could overcome even the passage of decades. For Elaine Mercer, justice had arrived after 40 years. For her family, and for the families of Vincent's other victims, the long wait had finally ended. And for investigators like Sullivan and Blackwood, the case stood as both a hard-won victory and a powerful reminder that no matter how cold a case might become, the pursuit of truth was always worth the effort. As Blackwood drove back to Boston that evening, she reflected on the connections that had ultimately solved the case. Connections between victims, between jurisdictions, between evidence preserved decades ago, and technology that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. Most importantly, the human connections. Sullivan's dedication to a case long after others had moved on, the Mercer's patience and faith in the system, and her own determination to give voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. In the evidence storage facility beneath the Boston Police Department, thousands of boxes still waited, each containing fragments of unresolved stories. For some, resolution might never come, but for others, the truth lay dormant in preserved DNA, in overlooked connections, in patterns waiting to be recognized. The key, as the Mercer case had proven, was simply refusing to let the dust settle permanently, refusing to accept that some mysteries must remain unsolved. October 2022 marked the one-year anniversary of Neil Vincent's guilty plea. The media commemorated the occasion with retrospectives on the case, interviews with family members of the victims, and updates on the Mercer Project's ongoing work. Behind the scenes, however, a troubling new development was unfolding. During a routine review of Vincent's journals as part of a behavioral analysis study, FBI specialists identified several passages suggesting Vincent may not have acted alone in at least 2 of the murders. The references were subtle, oblique mentions of the arrangement and my partner in research, but they appeared consistently throughout entries from 1984 to 1988, the period encompassing the murders in Vermont and upstate New York. Initially, we interpreted these references metaphorically, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Maya Patel. Serial offenders often personify their urges or develop elaborate internal narratives to justify their actions. But as we conducted deeper linguistic analysis, comparing writing patterns across the journals, we began to consider the possibility that Vincent was literally describing a second perpetrator. The implications were profound. If Vincent had indeed collaborated with another killer, that individual might still be at large. Given Vincent's death in custody, any information about this potential accomplice would have died with him. The task force, which had begun winding down operations following Vincent's conviction and subsequent death, was hastily reconvened. Tara Blackwood, now heading Boston's expanded cold case unit, was brought in as a consultant due to her intimate knowledge of the Vincent investigation. Her first action was to initiate a comprehensive rereading of Vincent's journals, this time specifically looking for any indications of a second person. The journals were never intended to be read by others, Blackwood noted in her preliminary report. Vincent wrote in a kind of personal shorthand, with references and allusions meaningful to him but often obscure to readers. We need to approach this as a code-breaking exercise as much as a traditional investigation. Working with linguistic specialists and behavioral analysts, Blackwood identified 37 passages potentially referencing a second perpetrator. The most significant appeared in Vincent's account of a 1986 murder in Burlington, Vermont. L handled the approach this time. His academic credentials provided the perfect cover, far more effective than my maintenance role. The subject responded with predictable trust. They always do when authority presents itself in familiar form. My contribution came later, after trust had been established and vulnerabilities identified. The division of labor makes the work more efficient, though I sometimes miss handling all aspects myself. This passage suggested not only that Vincent had a partner, but that this partner occupied a position of some authority in an academic setting, possibly a faculty member or administrator. Given that Vincent had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the University of Vermont during this period, the implication was that his accomplice might have been employed at the same institution. Blackwood presented these findings to the task force in November 2022. We need to proceed with extreme caution, she advised. If our interpretation is correct, we're looking for someone who has successfully concealed their involvement in multiple homicides for over 35 years. This individual would have established a respectable identity and would likely be well integrated into their community, possibly still in a position of trust. The task force's first step was to review employment records from the University of Vermont for the period 1985 to 1987, when Vincent worked there. The university's administration cooperated fully, providing personnel files for all faculty and senior staff from that era. The list encompassed over 300 individuals, many of whom had since retired, relocated, or died. To narrow the field, investigators cross-referenced university employment records with Vincent's known movements after leaving Vermont. According to his journals, Vincent had deliberately maintained some form of contact with his partner even after relocating to Syracuse. If the pattern held, they would expect to find someone who had also left the University of Vermont within a year or two of Vincent's departure. This analysis yielded 27 potential persons of interest, individuals who had left the university during the relevant time frame and whose subsequent career paths showed geographic overlap with Vincent's movements. Each of these individuals would need to be thoroughly investigated, a daunting task given the decades that had passed and the sensitivity of making inquiries about potentially innocent people. Raymond Sullivan, despite his advancing age, volunteered to assist with the investigation. His experience with the original Mercer case provided valuable perspective, and his status as a retired detective allowed for more discreet inquiries than might be possible through official channels. We're looking for someone who would have been in their 30s or early 40s in the mid-1980s, Sullivan observed during a strategy session. Educated, articulate, capable of inspiring trust in young women. Someone who, like Vincent, could compartmentalize their life effectively, maintaining a normal public persona while concealing violent impulses. The task force established a secure database to compile information on each person of interest. Background checks, employment histories, criminal records or lack thereof, and any potential connections to the murder locations were meticulously documented. The process was slow and painstaking, with many leads quickly proving irrelevant. By January 2023, the list had been narrowed to 8 individuals who warranted closer scrutiny. Of these, one name particularly stood out: Dr. Lawrence Harwood, a former psychology professor who had taught at the University of Vermont from 1979 to 1987 before accepting a position at Syracuse University, the same city Vincent had relocated to that same year. Harwood's specialization was particularly relevant, Blackwood noted in her case summary. His research focused on trust formation and authority dynamics in interpersonal relationships. He published several papers on how quickly people establish trust with perceived authority figures, especially in academic settings. The further investigation revealed that Harwood had left Syracuse in 1991, the same year Vincent relocated to Arizona. Unlike Vincent, however, Harwood had moved to a prestigious position at Northwestern University in Chicago, where he had remained until his retirement in 2015. Now 72, he lived in Evanston, Illinois, where he occasionally taught as an emeritus professor and had published a well-received textbook on social psychology. Harwood's background check revealed no criminal history, not even minor infractions. He'd been married for 45 years to the same woman, had 2 adult children and 5 grandchildren. His professional reputation was impeccable, with numerous teaching awards and a substantial body of published research. On paper, he appeared to be the model of a successful academic. The perfect cover, Sullivan remarked when reviewing Harwood's file. If Vincent's journals are accurate, we're looking at someone who used their understanding of human psychology not just to study behavior, but to exploit it in the most devastating way possible. The task force faced a delicate dilemma. The evidence linking Harwood to Vincent was entirely circumstantial. Parallel career moves and the vague references in Vincent's journals. There was no DNA evidence, no witnesses, nothing that would justify formal questioning, let alone an arrest. And if they were wrong, they risked destroying the reputation of an innocent man. We need to find a way to establish a definitive connection between Harwood and Vincent, Blackwood argued. Something beyond the coincidental timing of their career changes. Sullivan suggested a more direct approach. Sometimes the simplest method is just to knock on the door, he said. Not as law enforcement, but as someone researching Vincent's case. See how he reacts to Vincent's name, whether there's any recognition there. After extensive debate, the task force approved a modified version of Sullivan's suggestion. Blackwood and Sullivan would travel to Evanston under the pretext of researching a book about solved cold cases, with a focus on the Vincent murders. They would request an interview with Harwood as an expert on criminal psychology, specifically his insights on how killers like Vincent could evade detection for so long. It's a thin cover, Blackwood acknowledged, but it gives us a legitimate reason to mention Vincent and gauge his reaction without directly implying any connection between them. In February 2023, Blackwood and Sullivan arrived in Evanston. The university town was blanketed in snow, the northwestern campus a picture of Gothic academia against the white landscape. They had arranged to meet Harwood at his home, a stately Victorian in a neighborhood of similar historic residences. Lawrence Harwood greeted them warmly, every inch the distinguished professor emeritus. Tall and lean, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, He ushered them into a book-lined study where tea had already been prepared. If he harbored any suspicion about their stated purpose, he showed no sign of it, speaking articulately about his career and research as they established rapport. When Blackwood finally mentioned Neil Vincent, introducing him as the subject of their proposed book, she watched Harwood carefully. His expression remained politely interested. His body language relaxed as he reached for his teacup. "Vincent, the name sounds vaguely familiar. Was this a recent case?" he asked, his tone casual. Blackwood explained the basics of the case: the cold case resolution, Vincent's arrest and confession, the multiple murders spanning several states. As she spoke, she noted that Harwood's demeanor remained unchanged, his questions appropriate for someone hearing about the case for the first time. "Fascinating," he commented when she finished. "And you say he worked at universities where he found his victims. That's unfortunately not uncommon. Campuses create a false sense of security, closed environments where trust is the default state. My research has consistently shown how easily that trust can be manipulated." The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, with Harwood offering insightful commentary on criminal psychology and the dynamics of predatory behavior. Not once did he betray any personal knowledge of Vincent or the specific murders. As they prepared to leave, Sullivan asked one final question, deliberately casual. "Dr. Harwood, did you ever work at the University of Vermont or Syracuse University?" "I believe Vincent was employed at both institutions around the mid to late 1980s. Harwood nodded readily. "Indeed I did. Vermont from 79 to 87, then Syracuse until 91. I suppose our paths might have crossed. Though maintenance staff and faculty rarely interact meaningfully, large universities are surprisingly siloed environments." Outside in their rental car, Blackwood and Sullivan debated what they had observed. "He's either completely innocent or an exceptional performer," Blackwood said. "Nothing in his reaction suggested recognition or anxiety when we mentioned Vincent." Sullivan was less certain. That comment about trust being manipulated, it felt rehearsed, like something he said many times before. "And did you notice how quickly he volunteered, the exact years he worked at those universities? Most people would need to think about dates from 35 years ago." Their conflicting impressions highlighted the fundamental challenge of the investigation. Without concrete evidence linking Harwood to the crimes, they were left interpreting subtle behavioral cues that could be interpreted multiple ways. Returning to Boston, Blackwood and Sullivan reported their observations to the task force. The consensus was that while Harwood remained their primary person of interest, they had insufficient grounds to pursue him more aggressively. The investigation seemed to have reached an impasse. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In March 2023, Dr. Eleanor Matheson, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed Vincent's journals, requested permission to review Vincent's personal effects, items from his Tempe home that had been catalogued but not considered relevant to the original case. Among these was a collection of academic journals and psychology textbooks. "Serial offenders often keep materials related to their crimes," Matheson explained. "Given Vincent's methodical nature, I believe he might have preserved items connecting him to his potential accomplice." The request was granted, and Matheson spent several days examining Vincent's library. Her persistence was rewarded when she discovered marginalia, handwritten notes in the margins of several academic articles authored by Lawrence Harwood. The notes were in Vincent's distinctive handwriting, commenting on specific passages and occasionally addressing the author directly. "Brilliant insight, L." Or, "You've articulated what we discovered in Burlington." More significantly, tucked into one journal was a faded photograph showing two men standing beside a campus building. One was clearly a younger Vincent. The other, based on comparison with university photos from the period, appeared to be Harwood. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the journal entries, was a single line: "The Research Team, UVM 1986. This physical connection between Vincent and Harwood transformed the investigation. The task force now had evidence that the two men had known each other, contradicting Harwood's implication that they would have had little interaction. Combined with the suggestive comments in Vincent's journals and the parallel career moves, there was now sufficient cause for a more formal approach. In April 2023, federal agents interviewed Harwood at Northwestern University, this time directly questioning him about his relationship with Vincent. Confronted with the photograph and the annotated articles, Harwood's demeanor changed dramatically. The composed academic was replaced by a visibly anxious man who claimed any connection to Vincent was purely professional and minimal. "He was maintenance staff who expressed interest in my research," Harwood insisted. "I occasionally discuss psychological concepts with him, as I would with any curious person. Any suggestion of a deeper connection is preposterous." Harwood's denials, however, prompted investigators to dig deeper into his background. A thorough review of his publication history revealed a disturbing pattern. Each of his major papers on trust and authority had been published shortly after one of the murders linked to Vincent. More tellingly, his methodology sections referenced observational studies, with minimal details about participant recruitment or ethical approvals, unusual omissions in academic research. As pressure mounted, investigators obtained warrants to search Harwood's home and office. In a concealed safe in his garage, they discovered what would later be described as his trophy collection, items taken from victims that had never been listed in police reports, including Elaine Mercer's student ID card, which Vincent could not have taken as he had never directly interacted with her. The most damning evidence came from Harwood's personal computer. Despite his technological sophistication, he had preserved encrypted files containing his own journals, records that paralleled and complemented Vincent's accounts. Where Vincent had focused on the mechanics of stalking and killing, Harwood had documented the psychological aspects, analyzing victims' behaviors and responses with clinical detachment. On May 12, 2023, Lawrence Harwood was arrested and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Unlike Vincent, he showed no relief at being caught, no desire to confess. Instead, he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and retained a high-profile defense team. The evidence against Harwood, while compelling, was largely circumstantial. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on the journals and trophies found in his possession, along with the pattern of his career movements coinciding with Vincent's. Without Vincent's testimony, or DNA evidence directly linking Harwood to the crime scenes, securing a conviction would be challenging. In August 2023, as the legal process moved forward, Blackwood received an unexpected call from Northwestern University's Archives Department. During a review of materials donated by retired faculty, an archivist had discovered a collection of VHS tapes labeled only with dates and initials. Recognizing Harwood's initials from the ongoing news coverage, the archivist had reviewed one tape and immediately contacted authorities. The tapes, spanning from 1984 to 1990, contained recordings of Harwood's interviews with young women, interactions that began as apparent research sessions but deteriorated into something far more sinister. In several recordings, Vincent could be seen entering the room after Harwood had established rapport with the subject. The tapes provided the direct evidence linking both men to the crimes that investigators had previously lacked. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, Harwood's defense team approached prosecutors about a plea agreement. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Harwood would provide a full confession and assist in identifying any victims not previously connected to the case. On September 27, 2023, Lawrence Harwood appeared in federal court in Boston, the same courthouse where Neil Vincent had been sentenced 2 years earlier. The gallery was once again filled with families of the victims, including Margaret Mercer, now 90 and frail, but determined to witness this final chapter of justice for her daughter. Harwood's statement to the court revealed the full extent of the partnership between the two killers. They had met in 1984 at the University of Vermont, where Vincent attended a lecture Harwood gave on authority and compliance. Recognizing in each other similar predatory instincts, they had formed what Harwood clinically termed a research collaboration, using their respective positions to identify, isolate, and ultimately murder young women. Vincent handled the physical aspects, Harwood explained, in a detached academic tone that horrified the courtroom. I provided the psychological framework, the approach, the establishment of trust, the selection criteria. We were studying the boundaries of human trust, specifically how academic authority creates a presumption of safety that can be exploited. The judge interrupted Harwood's clinical description, reminding him that he was confessing to murders, not describing a research project. Harwood paused, then continued in the same dispassionate voice. I understand the legal and moral implications of our actions. I'm simply explaining the cognitive framework that allowed us to compartmentalize these activities from our public lives. Vincent and I operated effectively because we each fulfilled specific roles in the process. When he relocated to Arizona, I chose not to continue our work independently. The methodology required both components to be effective. In essence, Harwood revealed that he had stopped killing not out of remorse or fear of capture, but because the experiment no longer interested him without Vincent's participation. He had channeled his insights about manipulation and trust into his academic career, building a reputation as an expert on the very psychological mechanisms he had exploited to identify and isolate victims. The judge sentenced Harwood to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, families of the victims stood in silent witness, not in celebration, but in solemn acknowledgement that the long journey toward justice had finally reached its conclusion. For Raymond Sullivan, now 75 and increasingly frail himself, the resolution brought a profound sense of closure. The case that had defined much of his career and haunted his retirement had finally been solved completely. The invisible accomplice, the academic credentials that had helped lure Elaine Mercer to her death, now had a name and a face, and would face punishment for his crimes. Tara Blackwood, reflecting on the investigation that had expanded from a routine digitization project to the unmasking of 2 serial killers, found herself contemplating the nature of justice across time. DNA evidence identified Vincent, but it was human analysis, reading between the lines of his journals, recognizing patterns of movement, interpreting subtle linguistic cues that led us to Harwood, she noted in her final report on the case. Technology gave us the tools to find the first killer, but traditional investigative methods were necessary to find the second. The lesson for cold case investigations is clear. Neither approach alone is sufficient. It's the integration of new technology with traditional detective work that ultimately brings resolution. The Mercer Project continued its work, applying this integrated approach to dozens of cold cases. By the end of 2023, the unit had resolved 7 previously unsolved homicides and identified suspects in 12 others. Each resolution brought closure to families who, like the Mercers, had waited decades for answers. Margaret Mercer did not live to see the full impact of the project that bore her daughter's name. She passed away peacefully in October 2023, just weeks after Harwood's sentencing. At her funeral, Daniel Mercer spoke of how the resolution of Elaine's case had allowed his mother to find peace in her final months. For 40 years, my mother carried the weight of not knowing, he said. In the end, she was able to lay down that burden. The men who took my sister from us will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The system that failed us initially ultimately delivered justice, however delayed. My mother believed that mattered, not just for our family, but for all families waiting for answers. In Boston's evidence storage facility, Box M111928, the Elaine Mercer homicide file was returned to its shelf, now with a new label, Resolved. But the legacy of the case extended far beyond that single box. The methods developed during the investigation had created a template for addressing long-dormant cases, demonstrating that the passage of time, while a formidable obstacle, was not an insurmountable one. For Raymond Sullivan, who had carried the case for so long, there was a final moment of connection with the young detective he had once been. In clearing out his home office, preparing to downsize to a smaller residence, he found his original notebook from November 12, 1982, the day Elaine Mercer's body was discovered. On the first page, he had written a promise to himself: "I will find who did this." 41 years later, he had kept that promise. Not alone, and not as quickly as he had hoped, but with the same determination that had driven him since that cold November morning. Justice, he reflected, was not measured in days or years, but in persistence, in the refusal to allow the truth to remain buried, no matter how deeply time had tried to conceal it. As the Harwood case faded from headlines and public attention, turned to newer crimes and fresher outrages, the ripple effects of the investigation continued to spread through the law enforcement community. Cold case units across the country adopted protocols developed during the Mercer Project, applying new technologies to long-dormant evidence and re-examining old assumptions with fresh perspectives. For the families of Vincent and Harwood's victims, the resolution brought different forms of closure. Some found peace in knowing the full truth at last. Others struggled with the revelation that not one but two predators had conspired in their loved one's death. All, however, shared in the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. In the quiet corners of police departments across New England, boxes of evidence from other unsolved cases waited, their secrets preserved for the day when science, circumstance, and human determination might finally converge to give them voice. The lesson of the Mercer case, that no crime, no matter how cold, was beyond resolution if the will to pursue it remained, offered hope to those still waiting for answers. The dust would never again be allowed to settle permanently on these cases. That perhaps was the most profound legacy of Elaine Mercer, the law student who never lived to see justice served, but whose case ultimately transformed how justice was pursued for countless others who shared her fate. By early 2024, the revelations about Lawrence Harwood had sent shockwaves through academic and law enforcement communities alike. The case highlighted a disturbing reality, that predators could not only evade justice for decades, but could actually thrive professionally by applying their predatory insights to supposedly legitimate research. Universities across the country began reviewing their hiring practices and security protocols, particularly regarding staff access to students during non-standard hours. For Tara Blackwood, however, the case wasn't truly complete. While both killers had been identified and one convicted, several inconsistencies in their accounts of the crimes remained unresolved. Vincent's journals, while detailed, contained gaps and occasional contradictions. Harwood's confession, though comprehensive regarding his methodology, was clinically detached, omitting crucial details about specific victims. "We've established who and how," Blackwood explained to her team in January 2024. "But for several of the victims, we still don't fully understand when and where. If we're going to provide complete closure to the families, we need to resolve these remaining questions." The most significant gap concerned Elaine Mercer's murder. Vincent's journal entry described following her through Commonwealth Park, but made no mention of Harwood's involvement. Harwood, during his interrogation, had claimed to have facilitated the encounter, but was vague about specifics. Given that this was the first murder definitively linked to both men, understanding exactly how they had coordinated was crucial to comprehending their partnership. Blackwood decided to focus on reconstructing Elaine's final hours with greater precision. The original investigation had established that she left the law library at approximately 9:30 p.m. on November 11, 1982. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her pack her books and exit the building. The medical examiner had estimated her time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight, giving a window of at most 2.5 hours during which the murder occurred. What was Harwood doing during that time frame? Blackwood asked during a strategy session. In 1982, he was still at the University of Vermont, not Boston University. If he was involved in Mercer's murder, he would have needed to be in Boston that night. This line of inquiry led to a search of University of Vermont records for November 1982. Archives revealed that Harwood had been scheduled to give a guest lecture at Boston University's psychology department on November 10th, with a departmental reception the following evening. This placed him in Boston on the night of Elaine's murder, contradicting his initial claim that he had only advised Vincent remotely for the first killing. Further investigation uncovered a conference attendee list showing that Harwood had stayed at the Copley Plaza Hotel, less than a mile from Commonwealth Park. Credit card records, subpoenaed from archives, confirmed that he had checked out on the morning of November 12th, hours after Elaine's body was discovered. This establishes opportunity, Sullivan noted when Blackwood shared these findings, but it doesn't tell us how he and Vincent coordinated or how they encountered Elaine. The answer came from an unexpected source. In February 2024, Daniel Mercer, while sorting through his late mother's belongings, discovered a box of Elaine's personal effects that had been returned to the family after the original investigation. Among these was her academic planner for the fall semester of 1982. On the page for November 11th, she had made a notation: 8:30 p.m. Meet Dr. HRA Psych of Criminal Law Paper, RLRC. Daniel immediately contacted Blackwood. RLRC would have been the Roscoe L. Richardson Center, he explained. It was a small research building adjacent to the main library, used for interdepartmental collaborations. My sister was taking an elective on criminal psychology alongside her law courses. Could Dr. H. be Harwood? This notation provided the missing link. Harwood, as a visiting lecturer with expertise in legal psychology, would have been a natural resource for a law student with an interest in the psychological aspects of criminal behavior. The timing aligned perfectly. A meeting scheduled for 8:30 p.m. would likely have ended around 9:30 when witnesses saw Elaine leaving the library. Armed with this new information, federal prosecutors requested a supplemental interview with Harwood at the maximum security facility where he was serving his sentence. Initially, Harwood refused to cooperate further, maintaining that he had fulfilled the terms of his plea agreement. However, when confronted with the evidence from Elaine's planner, his demeanor changed. "Yes, I met with her," he finally admitted, his clinical tone giving way to something more contemplative. She was exceptionally bright, asked insightful questions about psychological profiling in criminal investigations. I arranged the meeting specifically because Vincent had identified her as a potential subject. We needed to establish trust, create a scenario where her disappearance would have multiple possible explanations. For the first time, Harwood provided a detailed account of the night of November 11th, 1982. He had met with Elaine as scheduled, discussing her paper and suggesting resources. The meeting lasted approximately an hour. As they were concluding, he offered to walk her home, citing the late hour and recent security concerns on campus. She initially declined, but he insisted, mentioning a shortcut through Commonwealth Park that would save time. Vincent was waiting at the predetermined location, Harwood explained. I'd built rapport throughout the meeting, positioning myself as a mentor figure. When we entered the park, I maintained conversation to distract her while Vincent approached from behind. It was all quite efficient. The clinical detachment with which Harwood described the murder, as if it was simply an experiment with expected outcomes, chilled even the experienced investigators. Yet his account filled in crucial gaps in the timeline and explained how Elaine, known to be cautious about walking through the park at night, had been lured into that vulnerable situation. That first collaboration established our methodology, Harwood continued. I provided the academic credibility that created initial trust. Vincent handled the physical aspects that I found distasteful. It was a more effective approach than either of us could have achieved independently. Harwood's revelation answered the central question that had troubled investigators: how two predators with different backgrounds and skills had formed their deadly partnership. Rather than competing or operating in parallel, they had recognized complementary capabilities and developed a methodology that exploited both their strengths: Harwood's academic authority and psychological insight, Vincent's practical skills in surveillance and violence. With this final piece of the puzzle in place, prosecutors formally closed the Elaine Mercer case. The full account of her murder was shared with Daniel Mercer, providing the complete closure his mother had sought for so many years. Though the truth was painful, understanding exactly what had happened that November night allowed Daniel to finally lay to rest the specters of uncertainty that had haunted his family for 4 decades. The resolution of the Mercer case had broader implications as well. Harwood's detailed confession revealed how the 2 killers had selected and targeted their victims, information that proved valuable in developing preventative protocols for campus safety. His clinical analysis of how academic authority could be weaponized led to significant reforms in how universities structured one-on-one meetings between faculty and students, particularly during evening hours. For Blackwood, the case yielded professional recognition, but also profound personal reflection. In March 2024, she was invited to present the Mercer investigation at the International Cold Case Symposium in London, a gathering of law enforcement specialists dedicated to resolving long-dormant cases. Her presentation focused not just on the technological aspects that had identified Vincent, but on the human elements that had ultimately revealed Harwood. Cold cases are not solved by DNA alone, she emphasized to the assembled investigators. Technology gives us tools, but understanding human behavior, recognizing patterns, reading between the lines, connecting seemingly unrelated events, remains the foundation of successful investigations. In the Mercer case, it was the integration of new science with traditional detective work that ultimately brought justice. The symposium presentation brought international attention to the Mercer project, resulting in collaborative initiatives with law enforcement agencies across Europe and Australia. By mid-2024, the methodologies developed during the investigation had been applied to dozens of cold cases worldwide, with promising results in several long-dormant investigations. Raymond Sullivan, though unable to travel to London for the symposium, watched Blackwood's presentation via video link from his new apartment in a retirement community near Rockport. At 76, his health had begun to decline, but his mind remained sharp, his interest in the case undiminished. When Blackwood returned from London, she visited him, bringing a recording of the panel discussion that had followed her presentation. "You know," Sullivan said, as they sat on his small balcony overlooking the harbour, "when I first started working on Elaine's case, DNA testing didn't exist in criminal investigations. Computers were the size of refrigerators. The idea that we'd eventually identify her killer through genetic genealogy would have seemed like science fiction. Yet you preserved the evidence that made it possible," Blackwood pointed out. "You collected and stored those samples decades before they could be effectively analyzed." Sullivan smiled faintly. "That's what good detective work is, preserving possibilities. You collect everything, document everything, because you never know what might eventually matter. Science catches up to evidence, not the other way around." As they watched the sun set over the harbour, Sullivan shared a letter he had received from Daniel Mercer following the final resolution of his sister's case. In it, Daniel had written, "For 40 years, we carried the weight of not knowing. That burden shaped our lives in ways we couldn't fully articulate. Now, though the truth brings its own pain, there is also relief in certainty. My mother spent her final months with the knowledge that the men who took Elaine from us would never harm another family. That knowledge mattered to her, not just as closure, but as affirmation that persistence toward truth is never wasted, no matter how long the journey." Those words resonated deeply with Blackwood. Like Sullivan before her, she had come to understand that cold case investigation was not merely about solving crimes, but about honoring a fundamental human need for truth and resolution. Each box in the evidence storage facility represented not just an unsolved crime, but a family suspended in uncertainty, waiting for answers that might allow them to fully process their grief. The spring of 2024 brought another significant development in the case. Lawrence Harwood, perhaps seeking to establish some form of legacy beyond his crimes, offered to assist behavioral analysts in developing profiles of other potential long-term, undetected killers. His detailed explanations of how he and Vincent had evaded suspicion for decades provided valuable insights into the mindset and methodologies of predators who successfully maintained dual identities. The fundamental error in most investigations, Harwood noted during one interview session, is the assumption that killers act impulsively or emotionally. Vincent and I approached our activities methodically, with careful risk assessment at each stage. We selected victims and environments that minimize potential evidence, established credible alternative narratives for our movements, and maintained separation between our public and private personas. Indeed, while investigators were wary of Harwood's motivations, his apparent desire for recognition as an expert even in custody, they couldn't deny the value of his insights. His detailed analysis of how he had weaponized his academic credibility helped identify similar patterns in other unsolved cases, leading to the resolution of 3 additional homicides unrelated to his and Vincent's activities. In June 2024, Blackwood was approached by true crime documentarians interested in producing a series about the Mercer case. After consultation with Daniel Mercer and the families of other victims, she agreed to provide technical consultation with the stipulation that the focus remain on the investigative process rather than sensationalizing the killers. The resulting 6-part documentary titled 4 Decades of Silence premiered in October 2024, bringing renewed public attention to the value of cold case investigation and the evolving technologies that made such resolutions possible. For the families of Vincent and Harwood's victims, the documentary offered an opportunity to honor their loved ones' memories. Several participated in the final episode, sharing photographs and stories that transformed the victims from statistics into individuals whose lives had held promise and meaning before they were cut short. This humanization served as a powerful counterpoint to the clinical detachment with which Harwood had described the murders. As 2024 drew to a close, the Mercer Project had expanded to include partnerships with forensic laboratories and law enforcement agencies across the country. The methodologies developed during the investigation had been formalized into protocols for reviewing cold cases, with particular emphasis on preserving biological evidence for future technological advancements. Blackwood, now recognized as a leading authority on cold case resolution, divided her time between active investigations and training the next generation of specialized analysts. Raymond Sullivan's health continued to decline through the autumn months. In November, he was hospitalized with pneumonia, his condition complicated by advancing heart disease. During what would prove to be their final conversation, he shared with Blackwood a perspective that encapsulated his 40-year journey with the Mercer case. "When you're a young detective," he said, his voice weakened but his gaze still sharp, "you believe justice operates on your timeline. You expect to solve every case, catch every killer, tie everything up with a neat bow. Experience teaches you otherwise. Sometimes justice takes decades. Sometimes you plant seeds you'll never see grow. The important thing is to plant them anyway. To preserve the evidence, document the details, keep asking questions. Someone else might harvest what you've sown, but that doesn't make the justice any less real." Sullivan passed away peacefully on December 12, 2024, exactly 42 years after he had been assigned to investigate Elaine Mercer's murder. At his funeral, attended by 3 generations of law enforcement officers, Daniel Mercer delivered a eulogy that celebrated Sullivan's unwavering commitment to a case that had spanned his entire career. "Raymond Sullivan made a promise to my sister," Daniel said, "a promise that outlasted changes in technology, shifts in methodology, even his own active career. He never forgot Elaine. When evidence went cold, when leads dried up, when others moved on to fresher cases, he kept that promise alive. The justice that eventually came was the result of many hands working together across time. But it began with one detective who refused to let the dust settle permanently on my sister's case. Orly, in the evidence storage facility beneath the Boston Police Department, Box M11 1928 remained on its shelf, now a historical artifact rather than an active case file. But its legacy lived on in the dozens of other boxes that had been pulled from storage, their contents re-examined with new technologies and fresh perspectives. Each represented a life cut short, a family waiting for answers, a truth obscured but not erased by the passage of time. For Tara Blackwood, the Mercer case had transformed from a routine digitization project to a defining investigation that shaped her career and perspective. What had begun as a simple effort to preserve deteriorating documents had evolved into a journey that spanned decades, connected generations, and ultimately demonstrated that justice, while not always swift, could still arrive with sufficient power to honor the memories of those who had waited so long for truth. As 2024 came to a close, she found herself reflecting on Sullivan's words about planting seeds you might never see grow. The Mercer Project continued to apply his philosophy to cold cases across the country, preserving evidence, documenting details, asking questions that might not be answered for years or even decades. It was a form of faith in future justice, a belief that the truth, no matter how deeply buried by time, would eventually find its way to the surface. The story of Elaine Mercer, the promising law student whose life had been cut short that November night in 1982, had become more than a tragic homicide. It had become a testament to persistence, a demonstration of how science and determination could overcome the barriers of time, and a powerful reminder that some promises, no matter how long they take to fulfill, are worth keeping. January 15th, 2025, dawned cold and clear in Boston. The federal courthouse stood imposing against the winter sky as spectators and media representatives gathered for what many were calling the final chapter in the Mercer saga. Though Lawrence Harwood had already been sentenced to multiple life terms, today's hearing addressed a distinct but related matter: the formal closure of all 11 murder cases connected to Harwood and Vincent's 4-decade reign of terror. Inside the packed courtroom, families of the victims sat in solemn rows. Some had traveled from across the country to witness this moment of collective resolution. Daniel Mercer, now the unofficial spokesperson for the families, occupied the same front row seat where his mother had sat during Vincent's sentencing years earlier. Tara Blackwood entered quietly, taking a place beside Daniel. Over the years of investigation, she had formed deep bonds with many of the families, particularly the Mercers. Though professional boundaries remained, there was no denying the shared emotional investment in seeing justice finally delivered in full measure. Judge Eleanor Ramirez, who had presided over both Vincent's and Harwood's cases, addressed the court with characteristic gravity. Today, we formally recognize the resolution of 11 homicides that remained unsolved for decades. While no legal proceeding can truly compensate for the loss these families have endured, we acknowledge the completion of justice long delayed, but ultimately not denied. One by one, representatives from each jurisdiction where murders had occurred presented their cases, officially marking them resolved. For some families, this was the first time they had heard the complete details of how their loved ones had been targeted, their paths deliberately crossed by two predators working in methodical tandem. When Boston's representative spoke about Elaine Mercer's case, Daniel reached for Blackwood's hand, gripping it tightly as he listened to the clinical recitation of facts that described his sister's final hours. The emotional weight of the moment was palpable throughout the courtroom, not just for the Mercers, but for every family that had lived for decades with unanswered questions. Following the formal presentations, Judge Ramirez invited family members to speak if they wished. Several declined, finding the moment too overwhelming. Others approached the podium to share brief reflections on lives interrupted and the long shadow cast by unresolved grief. Daniel was the last to speak. At 63, his resemblance to his sister was striking. The same thoughtful eyes, the same measured way of speaking. 43 years ago, he began, my sister Elaine left a library and never came home. Today, we finally close the book on how and why that happened. But this courtroom proceeding, necessary as it is, represents only the legal resolution. The human resolution, the processing of grief delayed by decades of uncertainty, continues for all our families. He paused, surveying the courtroom before continuing. I've often wondered what Elaine would have become. She would be in her 60s now, perhaps nearing retirement from a distinguished legal career. She might have had children, grandchildren. All those possibilities were stolen not just from her, but from our family and from the world that would have benefited from her contributions. Daniel's voice remained steady as he concluded. The men responsible for these crimes have been held accountable. That matters. The dedicated professionals who never stopped seeking truth have been vindicated. That matters too. But most importantly, our loved ones have been remembered, not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and purpose. In that remembrance, some measure of justice is finally fully served. As Daniel returned to his seat, Judge Ramirez thanked all participants and officially closed the proceedings. The moment lacked the dramatic tension of a verdict or sentencing, but carried its own profound significance. The culmination of investigations that had spanned generations of law enforcement and traversed enormous technological and methodological changes in how justice was pursued. Outside the courthouse, as families dispersed into the winter afternoon, Blackwood found herself standing beside Daniel on the broad stone steps. Behind them, the imposing facade of the justice system. Before them, the city where Elaine's promising life had been cut short more than 4 decades earlier. What comes next for you? Daniel asked quietly. Blackwood considered the question. There are other boxes in storage, other families waiting for answers. The work continues. Daniel nodded, understanding without further explanation. My mother used to say that grief suspended is the heaviest burden. Until we knew the truth about Elaine, we couldn't fully mourn her. I suspect you've given that gift to many families beyond ours. As they parted ways, Blackwood reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a routine digitization project had evolved into a case that transformed how cold case investigations were conducted nationwide. The methodologies developed during the Mercer investigation had already helped resolve dozens of long-dormant cases across the country. That evening, Blackwood returned to the evidence storage facility one last time. Box M, Alva 1928, Elaine Mercer's case file, had been designated for transfer to the department's historical archives, its contents now a template for training future investigators rather than an active investigation. As she placed the final documents inside, Blackwood included a letter Sullivan had written shortly before his death, his personal reflection on the case that had defined his career. It seemed fitting that his words would remain with the file, a testament to the detective who had kept a promise across decades. Sullivan had written, "Justice crosses time. What we cannot accomplish today, we preserve for tomorrow. The evidence we collect, the questions we ask, the details we document. These are not just for the present moment, but for future possibilities we cannot yet imagine." In this way, no case is truly cold as long as someone remembers to keep asking questions. Closing the box, Blackwood affixed its final label, Resolved, the Mercer Project. Today, though Elaine's case had reached its conclusion, its legacy continued in the ongoing work of the unit that bore her name, a lasting reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, need never be permanently denied.